Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. It's been 61 years since the Montgomery bus boycott, decrying racial segregation in public transportation. 60 years since sociologist C. Wright Mills' classic work, The Power Elite, warned of the dissolution of a real democracy in this country. 55 years since President Eisenhower's warning of the dangers of the military-industrial complex. 54 years since Tom Hayden, Stanley Aronowitz, a co-host on this show, and their Students for a Democratic Society colleagues helped write the seminal document of the time for the New Left, the Port Huron Statement, arguing that the political structure in America was organized political stalemate, calcification dominating flexibility, harboring a political apparatus where there's greater differences within each major party than differences existing between them. Most of the presidential candidates in this year's political campaign have been literally and figuratively individuals that have spent their youth and adult lives grappling with the same issues and concerns written about by Hayden in the Port Huron Statement of 1962. Most objective viewers would admit that even if they did not agree with the analysis, strategies, and tactics of the New Left of that time, the identification of the issues and struggles of the day by the movement were correct. Furthermore, it would be hard to dispute that these same issues continue to fester in greater complexity and destructiveness today, and that they demand change in even greater urgency than was the case 50 and 60 years ago. Port Huron's hope for change lay largely in the new generation. Young people speaking their minds as a form of rebellion against what they perceived as the oppression by the older generation, the establishment. Power to the People, the title of a song by John Lennon, a lyric by James Brown. Power to the people, people power. Pro-democracy students used it to protest the American military campaign in Vietnam. Power to the people, 'cause the people want peace, chanted by Public Enemy on their album New World Order. There are countless other examples. Participatory democracy, as Hayden would call it. Young people seem to have gotten it then, and they seem to be getting it now. Third-party candidates in the presidential race today are now showing commanding support among young Americans, indicating that nearly 40% under the age of 30 would prefer voting for them in the general election. We can only hope that more of their elders begin to get it too, and begin to act with the courage of their convictions, however they've had them dashed in the past. We know that the left can masterfully self-destruct, as it has numerous times over the last 50, 60 years, choosing the lesser evil as their candidate and mandate, rather than, as our guest on today's show would put it, choosing the greater good. The results have been disastrous for the country and world at every level of human and non-human existence. Neoliberal Democrats, conservative Republicans, so-called centrist presidents have all been largely beholden to anti-democratic forces that have created ecological, military, economic, and political catastrophes for the world and the great majority of humankind. We've created an intellectual, academic, and media world that sells out to the largest corporate bidder. Our moral and spiritual culture is driven by a fear-based cynicism and a moral, spiritual numbness to human, animal, and ecological violence and trauma. We're thrilled to have Jill Stein here on The Radical Imagination. She's the Green Party's nominee for president and has graciously taken some time with us in the middle of her hectic schedule to talk about the Green New Deal, the Power of the People plan, and the need for an inclusive and strong, people-driven, progressive movement, a movement that can truly transform the country and world. Hayden said it in 1962, our work is guided by the sense that we may be the last generation in the experiment with living. This time, and I know Jill will agree, we've got to get it right. Can't be fooled again. So welcome, Jill, very much to the Radical Imagination. It's great to have you on.
It's really great to be with you, and thank you for that inspirational introduction.
Well, thank you for the inspiration that you are now offering all of us here as the Green Party offers its, as you put it, Green Power Plan, Power to the People plan. Tell us a little about what you're trying to accomplish.
As you've said, in this election, we're not just deciding what kind of a world we're going to have, but whether we're going to have a world or not going forward. We really need transformational change because we're looking at a house of cards coming down, whether you're looking at the political system, our economy that serves the wealthy few, healthcare that 1 in 3 Americans cannot afford, even if they have health insurance, the debt that an entire generation is locked into, the wages of workers, if you're lucky enough to have a job, your wages are barely above the poverty level, and we have these endless expanding wars that are making us less secure while they're also making us bankrupt, and the climate catastrophe is coming closer. Each study brings the day of reckoning, closer to where we are. Now, most recent studies, including Jim Hansen, the foremost climate scientist, is talking about 2050, 2060, where we're expected now to have as much as 10, 20, 30 feet of sea level rise, civilization ending catastrophes that we have to start preventing now. So there are just so many reasons for us to stand up and to take our future back from this very corrupted, undemocratic system. And the great thing is that it's not so hard to solve this. There are solutions which are not rocket science and, in fact, which have been road tested. And the Green New Deal is one of them. It's based on the New Deal that got us out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. It's a jobs program. In this case, we're calling for 20 million good wage, that is living wage and up, jobs that transition us on an emergency basis to clean renewable energy, to a healthy and sustainable food system, and to public transportation powered renewably and efficiently, as well as infrastructure restoring, including our ecosystems, which are critical infrastructure for us in order to survive. So there are jobs there essentially for everyone, and we create the right to a job. And this job will move us to a revived economy, to push back against climate change and stop climate catastrophe that we are hurtling towards, and which will make wars for oil obsolete. So it actually allows us to bring a lot of that military money, which in fact is more than half of our discretionary budget. It's about half of your income tax, paying for these catastrophic wars that are making us less secure, not more secure. Instead, we can move those dollars, since we don't have the oil to fight over anymore. The Green New Deal makes the wars for oil and the bloated military budget to protect those oil sources and routes of transportation. It makes all that obsolete. So essentially, it pays for itself in military money that can be recouped and directed to true security here at home. The other thing to add about this is that we get so much healthier, and I say this as a medical doctor, we get so much healthier by zeroing out our pollution, and we call for zero fossil fuels by 2030. we would launch an immediate ban on all new fossil fuel infrastructure and instead put those dollars and that momentum into greening our energy system along with food and transportation. So by getting rid of fossil fuel pollution, we get so much healthier that our health savings alone from things like asthma and cancer and heart attacks and strokes and more, we get so much healthier that the savings in healthcare alone is also enough to pay the costs of the green energy transition. So this is a win-win-win, and it's based on a real model that we've actually used before. In this case, though, our jobs are predominantly in the green sectors of the economy in order to make that emergency transition, which is within our reach, and it pays for itself.
Incredible. This emergency transition. I'm just, in a way, dumbstruck by your comments. I mean, just in a few minutes, you've made links and more sense than all the major candidates have in the past several months. And again, it's not rocket science. It's so humane and compassionate and rational and logical. Why is this so difficult to get across? Or let me ask it another way. Do you think that the majority of people in this country, when given the options that you're offering in your program, what do you expect would happen? Do you think that the majority of people would readily accept it? It sounds like they would jump at these ideas.
Exactly, because every one of these pieces are things that the American public is clamoring for.
Right.
In poll
Right.
after poll, the public wants to solve the climate crisis. There are very few people who are in climate denial. There are a few, they're largely on the payroll of the insurance, of the fossil fuel companies, and there are some people that are under that sway. But for the most part, Americans see, that I'm here in the Northeast, and we're looking at 101 degree effective heat index tomorrow between humidity and a heat wave. We've had drought here for most of the summer. We have raging fires in California now, substantial drought in the Southwest. We're looking at the potential for sea level rise, dramatic and catastrophic sea level rise in a matter of decades. Devastating storms where you have these sudden, deluges, and people are dying from these sudden floods. Huge mudslides going on now in Latin America from the serious rainstorms. So, it's no longer like some distant and remote academic idea. People are seeing this in their everyday lives, and they're very concerned. So people are calling for really substantive, transformative action on climate. They're also calling for jobs. And, they're usually told you have to pick one or the other. Who is it that says that? Politicians who are on the payroll of the fossil fuel companies. That's what they say, because that's how they try to stop this movement in its tracks, by telling people that you have to choose between a job or the climate. That's preposterous. We won't have jobs unless we have a stable climate, in which our economy can function, so that we have water to cool our engines, so that we have a food supply to feed people. It's just, it's magical thinking, to pretend that somehow we're going to have jobs if we don't save the climate. We've got to do both of this, and that's exactly what people are clamoring for. So in my experience, when people have a chance to actually hear about this, they're right there. And that explains the real dynamic here. Why isn't this catching on? Well, actually, it is catching on. And we've come up in the polls from invisible, below the radar, now to where we're 5, 6, and even 7% in the polls before we've had any major media coverage whatsoever. So it's really word of mouth that's driving our campaign right now. We're fighting very hard to actually get into the debates. Major media has really been forced to start covering us. We're going to have our first major coverage actually on the 17th of August on CNN. We're doing a town hall meeting for an hour. So, go to our website and find out about it. And that's jill2016.com. So you know, already we are driving forward and defying, you know, the track record here. We've gotten farther, faster than any non-corporate campaign before. There are other third parties that are being heard, but they're corporate sponsored and they have some big money resources. We're the only non-corporate campaign out there that doesn't take money from big corporations, not from lobbyists, and not from super PACs. We don't have super PACs to coordinate with. So we are the one and only truly national people-powered campaign in this election. And we're breaking all records for actually beginning to penetrate the airwaves. So it's really exciting. And these kinds of solutions, like the Green New Deal, are actually getting out there, and people are overjoyed to hear that we don't have to, you know, roll over on the railroad tracks, you know, and wait to be run over. We can actually stand up, as you said, with the courage of our convictions, knowing that we have the solutions. And in fact, we have the numbers, just looking at the number of millennials who are locked into predatory student loan debt. Our campaign is the only one that provides a solution to that, and that is canceling it, like we did for the bankers that crashed the economy. We bailed out the crooks on Wall Street. It's about time to bail out the young people, and not so young people actually, who are locked into predatory student loan debt. And just remember, that's 42 million people. That right there is enough to win this presidential race, just on that issue alone. So don't accept for a minute this presumption that we are powerless and that there's no way forward. As Alice Walker said, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. We have it, and we're going to use it.
I think that's so important. I think one of your biggest issues here is this psychological barrier that you need to overcome, that exactly how you put it. We do have the power. It's time to manifest it. And it can't be stopped, in a sense. Although it would certainly, the two-party system was certainly going to try to pacify and scare people into not putting their efforts in your way or toward your cause. Again, because why? Because fear of what? Why is the two-party system in this country so fearful of these programs that you're trying to initiate and bring about?
Well, the simple fact, as you're probably aware, and most of your listeners are probably aware, the political parties that we have right now, both the Democrats and the Republicans, are sponsored by big money economic elite interests. So who is it? It's the big banks, the predatory banks, the fossil fuel giants, the insurance companies, the war profiteers, the real estate developers. This is who it is that sponsors politics, and they get their money's worth. You know, they provide the funding, the campaign contributions, and the lobbyists to help drive policy, and they are richly rewarded. If you didn't know that from looking around and just taking stock in your own life, study after study shows this. One of the recent ones often cited is this study out of Princeton and Northwestern called the Gillens and Page study. And what they found was that everyday people have almost zero influence on the legislative agenda in Washington, D.C., that what gets passed is what the big money interests want. You know, like, what are we looking at now? You know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's their next big move. Or you can look at the Affordable Care Act, which is not so affordable, not at all, and actually not so caring either. If you look at its track record, we could have passed a public option, a Medicare for all plan that covers everyone, head to toe, cradle to grave, everybody in, nobody out, saves $500 billion a year in red tape and paper pushing that it gets rid of, and basically for the same cost we're paying right now, it covers everybody. Instead of leaving tens of millions of people out, instead we can cover everyone, and far more comprehensively. You know, that's the kind of program that the political establishment will pass, because it provides a boondoggle for the insurance and pharmaceutical companies. So, the fear campaign is essentially the big money sponsors and the professional pundits and political apologists who are, they've got the fear in them because they are afraid of losing their little niche, their convenient little niche that makes them quite secure in this political system. But most people are being thrown under the bus right now, whether you're young people who are in debt, who can't afford higher education, and then who can't get a job. Even if they have the degree, they can't get the job to pay back those costs. If you look at Black lives on the firing line, in the target hairs, every week we're hearing about another just devastating, tragic episode of police violence. And it's not just violence in policing, it's in our prison system, this mass incarceration system, and it's economic violence with these racial disparities that are just unconscionable, where the average African-American family now has 5 cents on the dollar of wealth that a Caucasian family has. This is the result of generations of cumulative bias, racism, discrimination, white privilege, if you want to call it that, that's just baked into our economy and into a society that began centuries ago on the backs of African-American people in the criminal institution of slavery. So, or if you look at 12 million Latinos who are living underground, who are at the heart of their communities, who've been working jobs, paying taxes, are a productive part of our economies, not to mention our communities and our culture are part of what enriches us as a diverse society, who have to worry about what their future is. Republicans are the party of hate and fear, but Democrats have been the party of deportation and of detentions and of night raids against women and children, for God's sakes, who are fleeing the coup in Honduras that Hillary Clinton herself gave the thumbs up to. So no matter what you look at, we're not doing so good. We're just barely hanging in by a thread, and it doesn't have to be that way. We actually can have an America and a world that works for all of us. So we say, forget that lesser evil, fight for the greater good, like our lives depend on it, because they do.
Exactly. Tell us a little more about your battles with the neoliberals, why they have been so successfully attempting to pacify and co-opt progressive movements, and using the fear of having a Donald Trump in office as a vehicle to get the votes that I know you should and could be getting.
That's a great point. And what we're seeing with Donald Trump, we saw in the last election with Mitt Romney, it was John McCain before that. This is not to say that, that the Republican candidates are what we need, hardly. They're terrible. But the problem is this politics of fear has actually delivered everything that we're afraid of. All the reasons we're told that you have to vote for the lesser evil, because, say, in the last 2 presidential elections, you didn't want the expanding wars in the Middle East. You didn't want the drone assassination programs. You didn't want the meltdown of the climate and the expansion of fossil fuel emissions. You didn't want the attack on immigrants and their deportation by the millions. You didn't want the attack on the press or on our privacy rights, for example. All these things we didn't want, and so we were told to vote for the lesser evil. But what is it we got? We actually got all of that. And the bottom line is the politics of fear delivers everything you're afraid of, because democracy needs a moral compass. Democracy doesn't consist of figuring out who you hate the most or who you're most afraid of and voting against them. Because in doing that, we just silence ourselves. We create a moral vacuum, and we open the doors to the predators, the political predators, to come in. in the form of the various lesser evils. And it's a losing game. Just look at what happened when Obama was elected, and the first thing he did was to appoint Larry Summers as Treasury Secretary. Larry Summers, who had overseen the economic policies that deregulated Wall Street and ushered in the Wall Street meltdown and the crash of the economy. He laid the groundwork for it. And then Obama brought him in, when the economy had crashed. He's hardly the guy who was going to clean it up. And then they proceeded to bail out Wall Street to the tune of many, many trillions of dollars when they should have been bailing out the homeowners, or they should have been, taking over those banks and breaking up the corrupt, too big to fail banks and making them public banks, working for us, the people. And it became clear that that wasn't their agenda, and then when the midterm elections came around, the Democratic base didn't come out to vote, so the Republicans won. First one house of Congress, then the other house of Congress, then lots of our state houses and our governorships, that if you elect a lesser evil politician, people cannot bring themselves to come out and vote for more politicians who are throwing them under the bus. Who does come out to vote? The Republicans, who love it. Right. So, this is how the Democrats have suppressed their own base. Those victories for Republicans weren't really their victories. They were losses. They were defeats for the Democrats who couldn't bring out their base. The point here is that the lesser evil is not a solution. It's actually just a propaganda campaign. It's a fear campaign. The way we defeat Donald Trump is not by more of the policies that effectively caused Donald Trump. Why do we have this new surge of right-wing extremism? It's not just Donald Trump, a lot of right-wing stuff. It was most of the Republican candidates that had very similar policies in many ways, though they weren't quite so blatant about it. But, to look deeply, similar stuff on the economy, on immigrants, on war. And it's not just in the US, this is also happening in Europe. This is a response to the neoliberalism that you're talking about, to the globalization that creates a victorious class, global class of the economic elite, and they're running the show. And the terms of these rigged trade deals and globalization enables them to really escape democratic, controls within our own countries. They've sort of created a global elite that no one has control over. So that's what leads to the rise of right-wing extremism, because people around the globe are being thrown under the bus, workers, on our health, on the environment. That's what leads to the rise of Donald Trump. And who helped create those policies here in the US? This is Clinton policies to deregulate Wall Street, NAFTA, and then NAFTA on steroids, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And yes, Hillary has waffled a little bit, but her friends like Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia, says, oh, don't worry, she'll be back on track once she gets elected. The Trans-Pacific Partnership will go through, she will sign it. The Democrats are leading the charge here for exactly the things that are creating the economic misery that leads to the rise of the likes of Donald Trump. As Bernie Sanders himself said, the only solution here is truly progressive policies that are going to meet the economic needs of everyday people. That means investments in jobs. That means healthcare as a human right. That means education, including higher education as a human right, canceling that debt, and creating a foreign policy based on international law and human rights, not on economic and military domination, which is leading to absolutely catastrophic results. So this can be fixed. It's not rocket science how to do it, but it does mean, as you've pointed out, you have to block out these fear campaigns and recognize that they don't have the solution. They're just telling you, stay the course, in a downhill course that's just racing towards the cliff right now. This doesn't solve it. It just leads to further economic misery, to continue with the neoliberal policies of Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We need to stand up and start building our power so that we can move forward and get out of here alive. In this election, it's not just what kind of a world we're going to have, but whether we're going to have a world or not. The clock is ticking, and it's time for us to stand up.
That's a powerful, powerful argument. I think as a physician, what you're pointing out also is the unhealthy, extremely unhealthy, dysfunctional relationship between the two parties, that they feed off on each other and in various self-destructive ways need each other. And we become the vehicle through which they play out this illness, if you will, this sickness, this pathology. And what you seem to be also indicating is the only way out of this is through a transformative movement, intellectually, morally, spiritually, economically, politically. And I'm so glad you added that moral dimension in there. This show has been very much concerned with spiritual progressives. We've had Rabbi Michael Lerner on. Cornel West actually was on the first show with Stanley Aronowitz. And of course, he supports you very strongly, as does Rabbi Lerner. And this idea of radical love, of connecting people with the environment, with Mother Earth, if you will. I think this is a dimension that you're adding and a narrative that is so sorely lacking. I wish if you could just go further on that for our audience, because I think it's so very, very important.
Yes. Values are what bind us as a society. We are not a world of, every man for himself. We are a community, we are a human family, and people hunger for that, and that needs to be part of our political dialogue. And I feel so honored to have as close advisors and spokespeople in this campaign, both Cornel West, who is, just an exemplary shining spirit of love, of values, of community, and of spiritual insight and strength. And the same goes for Rabbi Michael Lerner. Both of them are just incredible spokespeople for our values as a human community. Ultimately, this is what bind us together, our values. And I think, we're at a point where we're kind of looking our mortality in the face. We're at an existential moment. If you look at the climate, if you look at expanding wars, if you look at the nuclear weapons race that we are once again involved in, Barack Obama has offered a $1 trillion budget for a whole new generation of nuclear weapons and modes of delivery. We are as endangered as the human race has ever been. And it's really important, I think, for us to move together and to come together around our shared values. I think in this country, being a country of immigrants from the get-go, thanks, of course, to our Native Americans, from whom we regrettably stole this land, and also the African Americans brought here as slaves. Otherwise, we are a country of immigrants. But because we are people from all corners of the globe, in this country, we've been able to have really a sort of distilling out of what is it that makes us, people? What is it that makes us humans? And I think we've really emerged with a sense of our basic shared human values, and that's human rights, it's international law, it is the right of future generations to survive, which is our sense of sustainability. It is the need to support Native peoples, to support the rights of minorities, whether it's African Americans or Latinos or the LGBTQ community or women or seniors. We are a society of human rights, and that's very much embraced by our campaign and by the Green Party. And, this is a a value system whose time has come in this existential moment. It's really important for us to check in about who we are and what is our moral compass. And with the likes of Cornel West and Rabbi Michael Lerner, we're very clear that we have a moral compass, that we are one community based on justice, equality, sustainability, and democracy.
Absolutely. Let me throw another name at you, another friend of this show. He's been on a few times. Dr. James Gilligan, psychiatrist, Harvard Medical School graduate, was the director of mental hygiene services in the Department of Corrections, Massachusetts for, I think, over 2 decades, was instrumental in bringing down violence, rates of violence, homicide, suicide, in those facilities, and is an international renowned scholar on violence and so on. The point I'm getting at here is that he has identified political cultures, economic cultures that practice humiliation, shame, disrespect in their policies, and these are the major reasons why we have such a violent world. Again, I'm giving a very, very short synopsis here of some of his major ideas. But in any case, I like the way you're trying to incorporate our common humanity, the need for respect and justice in the political policies, economic policies, and ecological policies that you're developing. I wonder, again, if you could just follow up on that, the idea of building social movements and political movements, economic movements that don't humiliate people, that don't disrespect them, that don't shame them, that don't put us in positions of ruthless competition, and a system that pits us against each other.
I so appreciate your perspective as a sociologist and your ability to stand back and sort of look at these unifying themes here. And I completely agree with you. We're in this situation right now where we have essentially a predatory economy. It's a paradigm based on profit, based on exploitation, based on squeezing profits out of people and out of the planet, out of our environment around us. And it's a very dehumanized paradigm that puts cutthroat competition and a religion of greed front and center. And I think this is a value system that most people reject. Actually, most people don't subscribe to this at all, but it creates a kind of vicious circle of a predatory economy, a school system which is being systematically unfunded, and where schools are being closed, especially in communities of color, and which are incredibly disadvantaged to start with. And then you have compounding educational advantage on top of disadvantage in the economy, on top of disadvantage in a violent and racist system of justice, and broken windows policing, so-called, where police have taken a rather aggressive stance against small lifestyle problems, and in anticipation, supposedly, of bigger problems. They're out to get people on little things. And this very aggressive form of policing has been linked with the rise of greater police violence and death at the hands of police. So you have these many systems of injustice that keep compounding each other. And add to that, please, a healthcare system with incredible health injustice, where your average African American has 7 years taken off of her life just for breathing while Black. And that's compounded by the health impact of poor education, which is concentrated again in communities of color, another 7 years taken off the life of your poorly educated American. And those two things are compounding to create up to 14 years taken off the life of the um, African American denied access to good education. So in this predatory system right now, where the linchpin actually is a predatory politics funded by the profiteers, you know, by big money, a political system, both parties that are hijacked by big money. You keep getting policies that keep exploiting people. And that includes also, let me add, food deserts and a food system that's designed to milk maximum profit out of people and our environment and farm workers and farm animals for that matter. It's a profit-driven system rather than a health-driven system or consumer-driven. We're talking about a very different paradigm, about a system change, so that we put, instead of profit on top, we put people, planet, and peace over profit, so that we have a system driven by human values. And when you start making changes here, again, now they compound each other. So instead of becoming a vicious circle, it becomes a virtuous circle where good things keep adding up. So for example, the jobs we call for that will fix the climate also turn out to not only get us out of poverty, because everybody has a good wage, minimum of a living wage job, so it ends poverty, but in addition, everybody gets so much healthier, including workers who are really the guinea pigs right now in this system, because they're the ones breathing the fumes and subject to the explosions and the equipment crashes and so on, that really are putting their lives at risk more than anyone. So when we move to a green economy, suddenly our workers are healthier, and guess what? Our communities are way healthier, because in getting rid of fossil fuels, we're not breathing that stuff. And we have a transportation system that suddenly is not dominated by the automobile, and kids can walk to school, and people can walk to a transit hub instead of having to, you know, purchase an automobile and take on the incredible expense. We get to use our muscle power, and we're eating healthy food, and we're not breathing in that pollution, and we're getting healthier. And it turns out when our kids are not surrounded by pollution, surrounded by poisonous food, and are not burdened by poverty, guess what? Kids start to learn again, because the biggest obstacle to education is actually poverty. So suddenly now our schools are doing better. And it's just a system in which everything starts working. And these good changes all compound each other. So, you know, there's kind of no end to where we can go with this when we shift paradigms from the kind of paradigm of the economic elite that wants more cutthroat competition because it feeds their profits, to a system based on economic cooperation, on putting people before profits, and on a system that actually serves us so that we are not serving this predatory system.
Well, let's go for a few minutes to the Middle East and see how this paradigm you're talking about can be applied there. The Palestinians, the Israelis. How do we begin to reduce the violence, establish more trust, restorative justice, these circles of peace between very hurt peoples who are acting obviously in very dysfunctional ways toward each other? How do we break these cycles of violence? How do we get people to begin to realize their common humanity?
Actually, I don't think it's so hard. Right now, we're applying a flamethrower to this crisis. Mm-hmm. So the United States is now supplying $8 million a day to an army, the Netanyahu Israeli army, which is in flagrant violation of human rights and international law. So for one thing, we in the US, with all due humility, because we've been a major part of this problem as well, we need to turn over a new leaf here and inform our friends in Israel that we are no longer going to be part of a system that is violating human rights, international law, committing war crimes with our dollars, the weapons we subsidize, et cetera, that we are not going to provide that our dollars, our subsidies, and our support will be reserved for governments that are in compliance with international law and human rights. So that's number one, is that we stop fanning the flames of the problem. Number two is that we need to raise up those people on the ground who are doing exactly what you're talking about. That is building trust, building confidence, actually establishing face-to-face relationships. And this is what the grassroots groups in Israel and Palestine are doing, the human rights groups that have been able to transcend this climate of fear and hatred, and have actually made friends and have developed relationships as human beings, and which are working to promote that. This should be the prevailing policy in Israel and Palestine. This should be the peace process, lifting up these grassroots groups who truly have the interests of peace at heart. Right now, we have an Israeli government whose major funder, at least one of the biggest funder I've heard of, is actually an American who doesn't live there, Sheldon Adelson, a casino magnate who has his own ideas and his own prejudices and doesn't live there. So he doesn't have to live with the consequences of his policies. But he is providing, as I understand, the major support that allows Netanyahu, it's basically his communications arm, his free newspaper with which he, with which he conducts his propaganda campaign, which is essentially Sheldon Adelson's vision of the Middle East. Why should Sheldon Adelson's vision be prevailing? He's not living there. So he's not living with the consequences of a policy which is extremely extreme and hostile and militarist and aggressive. Policy needs to be made by people in Israel. It shouldn't be bought by a big donor any more than US policy should be bought by AIPAC. We should not be influenced by people who have a particular agenda, whatever that agenda is. That's why we want to get the money out of US politics and get the people back in. I think same applies in Israel. We need to respect the work of the grassroots groups, the cutting edge grassroots groups who are actually making progress. Now we need to get behind that and stop interfering with it.
On both sides.
Yes.
Exactly, right?
Exactly.
Okay. It's interesting, and I'm sure you're aware of this too, that so much of what you're talking about does have its roots in the need for more democracy. Isn't that the case in power to the people, the Green Power movement, and so on, participatory democracy? Some of the struggles that many of the candidates, including yourself, were involved in since the 60s, right? I mean, in a sense, we're involved in the same sort of conflicts and struggles, and we're still trying to work those debates out, those paradigms out. And I know I met you the first time with another of your followers and advocates and admirers of Felipe Cornell, Immortal Technique. And as I talk with you here, Jill, the humanness, the humanity, the warmth, the giving that you express, it just comes out in your personality, and the need for music and art and artistic expression that Felipe, of course, that's the connection I was making there, also represents, is something that's been so lacking in this campaign. And I appreciate very much the feelings that the emotions that you're, and of course the powerful arguments that you're giving for your movement here. So I wonder, how were you affected by the 60s, and do you feel that we're still going through some of those same struggles?
Very much. I was very inspired by the 60s, by the civil rights movement, by Martin Luther King, um, by the women's movement, by the peace movement, by the many movements of the day. And my value system, just emerged in that era. And I very much agree with you that these struggles for justice and democracy and peace go hand in hand, and they're very much alive. They've not been solved. In the 60s, we made some real progress, bringing the troops home from Vietnam, the Voting Rights Act, establishing the EPA, and then we came into the decades of incredible pushback. And, there's a really compelling story about sort of the rise of corporate lobbying and of the corporate presence in government that really arose as a response to the 60s and the development of the Chamber of Commerce and a number of institutions, basic corporate institutions that hijacked our political process, and ultimately the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. And I think it's taken us some decades to get a handle on this. I think the internet has everything to do with our shared understanding and coming to grips with how the forces of darkness really are playing out right now through our communication system, et cetera. And, kudos to those whistleblowers, again, from Chelsea Manning to Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, that help us understand how our communications have been hijacked. I think we're at an unprecedented moment in history right now. Human survival has never been as precarious as it is right now, but I think our power as a movement has never been as great as it is right now. The social movements are thriving. We stopped the Keystone Pipeline. We prevented the privatization of the internet. We were told resistance is futile, don't even bother. We changed Federal Communications Commission policy, FCC policy, enormously against the odds. We did the same thing in Congress. We stopped the first Syria bombing campaign in 2030 by just standing up and saying, no, not in our name, this is crazy. And this is a time that we need to do that, bringing all these movements together. And I think we're at an amazing moment right now because people understand we can't be divided. If we're divided, we're conquered, that it's not a matter of choosing whose agenda item is going to prevail. They're all going to prevail. We need a spectrum of justice, economic, racial, labor, women's, climate.
Jill, I couldn't agree with you more. Where unfortunately we are reaching the last minute or two of our show here, and it's just been incredibly wonderful to have you on. And again, thank you so very, very much for what you're doing and carrying on with the movement.
Thank you. And I'll just say, we do have the power to create an America and a world that works for all of us. Go to Jill2016.com or join us at Dr. Jill Stein, Dr. No period, Jill Stein, and join the team. Together we are unstoppable. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. For this. Social movements of any form, for the most part, are exceedingly rare socio-political historical phenomenon. Even when they do emerge and develop, most of the time, most people root themselves on the sidelines and don't participate in any meaningful way. Furthermore, even when crisis conditions and variables seem ripe for these movements to grow, as is obviously the case today in America and around the world, it becomes exceedingly difficult to predict and channel these energies in the form that is desired by any specific party, group, ideology, leader, or interested communities. On the other hand, when conditions of immiseration and anger, again, obvious to any objective viewer of America, are there, and there are social resources, organizations, intellectual and moral fervor and commitment to structure and channel them, they sometimes go far beyond expectations. Starting in a somewhat obscure way through the Montgomery bus boycott, the Southern phase of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s gradually developed into a universal human rights movement that today touches and affects the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world. We are at one of these defining moments. Jill Stein and her Green Party presidential campaign certainly represents a refreshing, idealistic, necessary, and challenging commitment to change. The radical imagination supports and urges people to become involved. No one person can do it alone. It's up to the people to bring about the revolution it wants and needs. As Jill says, we are the people and movement we've been waiting for. Thank you, Jill, so very much for spending time with us on the Radical Imagination. This is your host, Jim Vrettos. See you again next week.